So I'm Colleen Costello, I'm the CEO of Vive. Thanks so much for everybody joining today. I look forward to telling you a little bit more about what we do as a company and also specifically the light disinfection space, generally speaking for infection control. And I want to make sure there's enough time as well at the end so that we can get into questions. I'm sure folks in this room are well aware of light-based tools that could potentially be used for infection prevention. Our company happens to do a very specific line of that, but I will get into that as we kind of proceed through the presentation today. So what we'll be focused on is non-ultraviolet antimicrobial light. So there's a lot of different ways to use light to kill germs. There are very specific ways in which you can use safe, continuous tools, though, with non-UV light in order to be effective through illumination and also for decontamination purposes. So I'll go through a little bit of that. For this room, I don't need to spend too much time. I think we're all very well aware of the challenges that germs cause. Unfortunately, our company is based in the United States, but in particular, we pulled out some statistics, particularly in the UK, that obviously have significant human and economic costs. We know this, anything from, I heard just briefly before, Candida auris, C. diff, all of these significant challenges. It's not only particular to the human cost, but the economic cost is significant. I actually had a personal experience. My grandmother contracted a MRSA infection in a hospital in New York, and that's where I started to dive into the challenges around germ control, particularly in hospitals. And so that's essentially what was the genesis of what we do today, is to try to address surface and air decontamination. Again, you'll have a lot of these slides as follow-up, but this is just a snapshot of all the issues that we're well aware of that are caused by these surface contamination problems. And some of these organisms can live for days to weeks on surfaces. And so if you have any lapses in cleaning, any lapses in disinfection, you're going to have a lot of very significant challenges that obviously we're all here at this conference to try to address and discuss. What we particularly try to do is to impact the environment. So we're looking at surfaces that have germs on them at all times, the surfaces that we're actually all touching. And if you leave, for example, an E. coli behind, right, in the beginning of the day and there's not appropriate disinfection, you're going to have over 2 million of these E. coli over the course of the end of the day. And that's obviously a significant challenge, is that these germs are living, breathing, and replicating within these environments. And so intermittent cleaning can be what is some of the challenge as it relates to environmental decontamination, is that when we're only intermittently cleaning, it leaves behind a lot of challenges. This is just one statistic pulled out of Boston that was done there, where they actually were swabbing surfaces, anything from the back of an ambulance to a operating room table, and they found just standard manual cleaning. Again, doesn't necessarily matter what the chemical cleaner is, it's a matter of the labor element of the manual cleaning, that they're getting about 32% of what's on that surface. I know I certainly wouldn't want to be on an operating room table with this type of statistics, and so that is essentially what we are trying to now utilize with LED technology to be constantly addressing that. So in our perspective, there needs to be a lot of new innovations in order to drive differences in the environment. And there are, fortunately, ways that we can do this that don't include manual labor, that don't include staffing to be able to have to utilize and address some of these major gaps that we have in traditional cleaning. And so there's a lot of different options. You see a lot of folks here with different options for that. And that's our perspective, is that we need really a multi-layered defense system in order to address particularly environmental challenges that are such a problem that I was just discussing. So we offer particularly a visible light that is antimicrobial, and the real differentiator is that it is essentially safe to be used around people. And that makes a huge difference for what we're trying to address, which is the continuous solution. So this is just a snapshot. Again, I'm sure a lot of folks in this room are well aware of sort of this concept, but episodic cleaning versus continuous cleaning ultimately has a large cumulative effect on the organisms within the environment. So this just gives you, again, this is just representative, right? But when we look at normal manual cleaning, you have organisms that are growing potentially, some of them during the course of the day, and then you clean it, brings it back lower, and then goes back again. So you have all these areas under the curve in which is risk that somebody could obviously touch that germ or come in contact and get an infection. What we particularly look to do is, if we can have a suppressing effect within the environment at all times, you can actually drive down to a significant and sustained reduction in those organisms, as opposed to this sort of episodic version of cleaning within the environment. So if you can do that with a antimicrobial light, and I'll talk obviously a little bit more about that, this is what we've demonstrated within clinical environments, is that there's a sustained and significant reduction over many years of the technology being installed. So it helps fill some of these major major gaps that there currently are within cleaning procedures. So that brings me to the light itself. So there's some really interesting properties of 405 nanometer light that actually impact porphyrin molecules within organisms. I'll touch again in more detail on that, but essentially 405 nanometer, and I'll show you a little here, I don't want to blind anybody, but so it essentially looks like a violet light. That is what, it's simply a violet light. It looks like ultraviolet, so a lot of folks assume that it's ultraviolet, but it is not. So there's a big difference between the UVC range, which is sort of more traditional disinfecting tools, and there's a lot of great products that kill germs very well in the ultraviolet range. The big challenge is that's also dangerous to be used around people, and so there have to be safety limitations accordingly for UVC technology. But at the 405 nanometer range, you can see it's significantly further, even though it kind of looks like in the same violet range. At the peak at 405, it has a very specific antimicrobial action. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to make sure that folks are aware of the big differences in the spectrum, because again, even visually, they can look very similar. So what happens at the 405 nanometer peak actually is it excites porphyrin molecules on the extracellular matrix of these organisms. So again, representative, but it excites the porphyrin molecule, and it doesn't degrade the porphyrin, but it actually breaks off reactive oxygen species into the cell. And so that reactive oxygen species ultimately explodes the organism, essentially, right? Just for representative terms. So it just happens to be that 405 nanometer light. That's not something that's proprietary to us. That is just a law of nature. Those wavelengths were not necessarily able to be generated artificially before LED technology. Now we have LED technology where you can have something that is essentially much smaller than a thumbnail, for example. This would be one of the LEDs. That's able to generate at that frequency in order to actually have this effect. So essentially, it's a reactive oxygen species exploding the cell within. So it's an oxidation, which is similar to how bleach works and other things. It just happens to be targeted through 405 nanometer light. And the organisms that have been demonstrated globally, again, not just our research, globally to be effective are listed here, anything gram-negative, gram-positive, spores, and also viruses. Slightly different mechanism there. It was interesting, obviously, with SARS-CoV-2 to do a lot of that type of testing commercially in the States, but it is effective against the range of these organisms. There's obviously dosage differences, just like anything that's going to be sort of a decontaminant or disinfectant. There's going to be dosage differences in how long it takes to kill spore versus gram-negative, gram-positive, but ultimately that's some of the benefit. If you can have the light on at all times, it's going to ultimately kill the organism. It's just going to be a time-dependent response. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Particularly for safety standards, one of the reasons we can actually use this technology, and I will give you some visuals in a moment of how it's installed within a healthcare setting, but we're talking about overhead lighting. So there are photobiological standards for light safety. Believe it or not, that's the case for these sort of chandeliers above you, it's the case for lasers, it's the case for fluorescence. So this is a normal regulatory procedure as it relates to safety for the technology, and particularly 405 nanometer falls in the exempt category for continuous and unrestricted use. Interestingly enough, the reason that's the case is those porphyrin molecules I was referring to. We don't have them in our skin, thermal, retinal are the three main considerations for safety around people, and there's just no reactive category for this within human cells, and so therefore it can be used constantly around people. This is an independent body. Different countries have different regulatory standards, but it's the same concept around being safe to be used around people because there's no impact on our particular cells because we don't have the same porphyrin that's excited in this instance. So getting to the clinical environment, this would be an example that we have use cases as it relates to an operating room. So really it's overhead fixtures. You can tell it looks essentially like a normal overhead fixture, which was the purpose behind the design. And so we have different modes, and the white mode in particular, I can show you here, which literally is just a white light. You won't be able to notice anything special about it, has the 405 nanometer pump within it. And so the white light itself actually is also antimicrobial, but it is intended to appear just like a normal white light, essentially, within the operating room environment. And then in operating rooms in particular, for example, at night when they're often not used, you can switch to a higher intensity mode, which is here, which is just the violet, because it's still safe to be used around people, but it's not essentially, it's going to be violet within the space. So that is for a healthcare environment in particular, how the implementation would look. And the intention is a set it and forget it. it. What I was mentioning before about sort of manual labor and cleaning, really not even intended to have folks need to do anything other than just use lighting like normal. And that's essentially what the design is. And what is happening here now is it's constantly suppressing organisms within the environment. I'll talk a little bit about the data associated with that, but this is really the practical implementation. And this happens to be an operating room, but we do anything from ERs to ICUs to oncology suites, you name it. And so what we typically do when we're working with a facility that is implementing the technology is we get something like this as a design, which often it might be your architect, engineer, facilities group, whoever might have this information. Ideally, it's best if it's pre-construction because then we can obviously have the technology embedded in advance. But we also definitely do retrofit opportunities. And often we're working with folks like yourself that know their facility and know where they might have challenges. Some hospitals say that they have issues in there. They just have very acute issues in their oncology suite or their ICU or their ER, et cetera. And they know that obviously based on their infection prevention is there. And then we would essentially just provide an installation. But anywhere that there's really high traffic areas, obviously, anything that are major prone to infection challenges is where you would want something that's obviously suppressing the organisms within the environment. So this covers essentially a lot of what I was just mentioning at the beginning was a lot of the gaps that we have today in current cleaning protocols, whether it's inefficient, improper, you name it. And so there's just a lot of Venn diagram in the middle that unfortunately allows for a lot of risk for the patient and for staff and everything along those lines. And so something like the visible light spectrum can be continuously addressing this challenge overall. And I think I heard earlier some presentations, obviously antibiotic stewardship, there's all these elements that any of these technologies and tools can really help combat some of these significant challenges that we have within the built environment in particular. So I'll touch a little bit on the efficacy for the demonstration of this in effect, essentially, within real environments. So there's also a lot of research outside of just our organization. I'm happy to follow up with folks that are interested in the research associated accordingly. But essentially what is demonstrated is that by simply changing out the lighting in a space, with something that has the 405 nanometer pump, there's significant and sustained reductions. It could be 2, 3, 4, it depends on the environment, it depends on what organisms were being tested. There's a significant amount of published peer-reviewed research to demonstrate this. Our company has been around for 13 years doing this, and we don't just do hospitals, we do anything from trains, planes, automobiles, schools, you name it, that are essentially in the same cases demonstrating significant reductions within that environment. So this is all publicly available if interested. I'm happy to share that. This was recently in Nature. This was our product, actually published out of Cornell in the States, demonstrating this. In this particular case, it was for food processing materials. So food processing is a whole nother major challenge for germ control. Unfortunately, there's outbreaks, certainly in the States very regularly. Just, any given week, you can open up a newspaper and there's some food contamination issue. So this was demonstrated particularly by these researchers at Cornell that the packaging materials had a significant reduction in the organisms within those packaging materials, which contribute a lot to foodborne illness, unfortunately. So this is in Nature if you're interested in that as well. I'll go through here a little bit what I think there's reams and reams of data. This was at the Wadsworth Biodefense Laboratory, essentially testing particularly against C. diff spores, which was something we wanted to, obviously, is a major issue throughout the hospital system, so we wanted to demonstrate efficacy on that. And then this was an interesting study, actually, particularly in a trauma room. And what you can see here is the colony counts before installation. And you can see, so that this is the sort of regression, if you will, of the colony counts. And then we had, you can see the significant drop in organisms in that case. But what was also interesting in this case is there was a regulation, a law that changed in Florida where the hospital was, and the patient minutes doubled. So there were double the amount of time patients and people were in the environment, but yet it still had this significant and sustained reduction. Again, just by changing out the overhead lighting, that's all they had to do and just turn the lights on during the day. So this was interesting just because of the correlation to more patients and significantly less organisms. This was recently at a pharmaceutical conference. Pfizer presented this. This is their information, actually, where they were particularly doing it in a already very low CFU environment. So this was gowning rooms that we're talking about single-digit colony counts. So unlike here in a hospital setting, right, there's thousands. This is in the single digits, and so for them, these are major risk points for going into the bioreactors. And so they presented this in particular because of, again, the sustained and significant reduction just by changing out the lighting. So it's interesting to see in all different types of environments where this continuous suppression is actually very helpful and effective. Particularly viruses, obviously we get a lot of questions on virus related because it's a slightly different mechanism than what I was just describing earlier on the bacteria element. But this, we of course had a significant amount of interest and questions on SARS-CoV-2 in particular for obvious reasons. And so this particularly was showing over a 97% reduction. And again, all of this is time-based. So it's very joule dosed and time-based, but particularly this was important information that I assume we'll continue to get questions on. Candida auris, we all know, I think I heard briefly in the last presentation how significant of a challenge that Candida auris is. So there's efficacy here as well, particularly if you see, we actually did a number of different test cases here, but anywhere from, it could be 65% to 99%. Again, it depends on the time, it depends on what type of surface that it's on. But ultimately, the continued suppression is what the goal is. There's also air impacts. So obviously the light before it gets to the surface is going through the air. And so there are impacts. This is a particular protocol that our team has developed that has been recognized by a number of regulatory bodies globally, but it's demonstrating essentially efficacy also on the air. That's also dependent on HVAC system, circulation, what might be going on in the environment, but obviously the light is impacting the air, and we've demonstrated that reduction as well. So we started on surfaces because of how big of a challenge that is, and now it's also demonstrated efficacy as in the air. So again, it's a total room environment cleaning solution, essentially. I'll just give a quick little bit about our company, and then I want to make sure we have some time for questions overall. So we're a New York-based company. We particularly specialize in this technology and a whole plethora of different products to address these challenges. And we've got over 60+ patents in this space, in the UK and elsewhere, really on particularly the white light element of what we do, because 405 nanometer truly is a law of nature, but being able to have it as a high-quality white light. I'm even noticing some of the lighting in here. You can tell different quality of lighting, and so that's a pretty important element, is actually the white light that actually looks good also for doctors, nurses, for example, that need to actually have visual acuity. That's a pretty important element, and so that's a lot of what we've worked on, is being able to take, this happens to be an athletic facility that we've done in the States, take a violet light and build it into a white light that is effective to be used to illuminate the space, but also obviously provide the antimicrobial protection as well. So that's just another example of what that looks like. This is rather technical, so I'll leave this maybe for questions, but essentially what we do is really being able to do all of that in a single LED package. So it ultimately looks simple, something like literally this LED, but it is actually quite complicated to get the violet light baked into a single LED package, but that's what allows us to do it in such a streamlined way. So we have fixtures, but it can also be anything to behind an elevator button, for example, we've done in a number of applications, because that's a huge high touch point where obviously you want to have some sort of antimicrobial benefit. But that's a little bit of the kind of the technical side of things. But my recommendation as you're evaluating technologies in this space for the built environment, it is pretty important to see them physically, typically, because there's a whole different variety of quality challenges around light. You can't just say it's white light. There's warm light, there's cold light, there's different CRIs, and so the quality of the light is also really important. This just gives you some very quick examples of things like fluorescing that can occur, or different types of visual acuity, color rendering. So it is important, especially we do some very large hospital projects. It's very important that the customer sees what the product is and deciding on what the color temperature or color rendering might be accordingly. And what comes baked into all of this is a lot of intellectual property, but it's anything from LED technology to fixture levels to control systems. We have a number of interesting control systems applications that we are working on with our partner here, Savage Lighting, that can be adapted so that you have some form of UI, for example, to be able to see what's going on with the lighting, how long has it been on, what's the dosage been, so just give you a little bit more intel and information, but that all is kind of behind the scenes. And then what it looks like commercially in order to offer this is really there's very little limitation in terms of the type of fixtures that we could implement. And so it's really just a mechanical housing, right? As I said, the LED is the core of what's providing the antimicrobial benefit. So it could be anything from task lighting to troffer lighting. This is for pharmaceutical applications, downlights, which are more applicable for bathrooms, for example, which are a huge pain point, obviously, in terms of the environment and the cleanliness. So often we do downlights within the restroom environment. So happy to work with you if in any way as it relates to the actual form factors and what you need. So it's not just contained to those rectangular fixtures that I just spoke about. It can be very flexible. And fortunately, one of the reasons we're here in the UK is we have a great partner, Julie, partners here in the back with Savage Lighting, that is here in the UK, does manufacturing here, and has a whole plethora of options for the types of solutions that you might need depending on the environment. So we'll be here all day, but they're a licensing and distribution partner of us at pretty close to here, actually. And so this would be very useful if there are applications here in the UK that are of interest. Julie and I are happy to talk in more detail. And this is just a quick snapshot of the types of customers. As I said, we've been in business for over a decade, so we do a lot of work in the US, starting to do more here. We've got a number of partners in Europe that we work with and are doing a number of studies, so happy to talk with folks that might be of interest